Sometimes on this channel, I'm not just experiencing a video game that I've never played before, I'm also experiencing a piece of media that I'm not familiar with, be it a TV show or a movie that I'm watching for the first time to really prepare myself for reviewing the video game based off of said media. Now, this has happened a few times so far. For instance, when I watched Tailspin, the Disney afternoon cartoon show centered around the further exploits of Baloo the bear from the Jungle Book, to better get a handle on reviewing the Genesis game of the same name back in episode 167. Or when I unfortunately subjected myself to watching Three Ninjas Kick Back for the reviews of the Genesis and Sega CD games of the same name in episodes 18 and 118 respectively. And no, I did not watch the movie twice on that one. I don't hate myself that much. Being that it's spooky season and that I had an open spot in the schedule this week, I decided to seek out a game that's Halloween appropriate. And while there is more than a few games in this catalog behind me that would fit that bill, Ghostbusters, Splatterhouse, Ghouls and Ghosts, not to mention lesser known titles like, say, Devilish, I thought I would go with something a bit more classical. And when I say classical, I don't mean Universal monsters from the 1930s. Oh no, I mean let's take it all the way back to the written word and then release an updated version in the 90s. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are confused because this is supposed to be a crappy video game review channel, not a crappy movie review channel. Don't worry, I know how to stay in my lane. I don't want any part of movie reviews. That can be Cinemassacre's problem, especially this time of year. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'm not allowed to review movies because my idea of a Halloween classic is Ernest Scared Stupid. Know what I mean, Vern? Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Now, if I was going in chronological order like I often do for game series, I would start with Bram Stoker's Dracula, which came out in the theaters in 1992 and debuted on the Genesis in 1993. And while of course I will eventually get to Dr. Acula, I wanted to go with a different title that had classic inspirations, that being Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, based on the film from 1994, which in turn was then based on Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus, which originally dates back to 1818. Now, you might be wondering why I chose to go with Frankenstein over Dracula, and actually it's a pretty simple reason. Before this week, I was somewhat familiar with Bram Stoker's Dracula, the movie, I mean. While I've never sat down and watched it all the way through, I've seen probably at least half of it. On the other hand, I knew nothing about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I had no idea who the actors were that were in it, how close they mirrored the original book, nothing. This made me curious, so I thought, what better time to really get to know this material and watch a movie than Halloween? So I did, and I have thoughts. What did I think about the movie? And how well does the game reflect that film? And most importantly, is it any good? Well, I'll talk about all that and more, but first, a look at the package. And here's my copy of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein for the Genesis. This copy is in decent shape, with the inside faring a lot better than the outside. The hang tab has been removed from the top, and there's some dings to the outer cover, mainly on the outsides and the back. Thankfully, the inner cover has come out mostly unscathed, with really the only major issue being that there's some sun bleaching on the spine. If you look close, you can tell it's not quite as red as it's supposed to be. I was a bit surprised, but with this being a later release, or maybe due to something else that I'll go into in a minute, it's actually somewhat valuable, at least compared to some of the other games I review on the channel, and complete copies currently go from anywhere between $35 and $50, so I'll definitely just hold on to this one. That thing that I was mentioning that might be affecting the value here is this sticker that's on the inner cover, not the outer cover, a rental special. Now, I'll be honest, I have no idea what's going on here. I've done some research and I can't find any reference to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein being a rental exclusive. Now, I should probably back up for a second because for the younger audience that wasn't around back then, people used to actually go to stores and rent video games and movies. To create hype and demand due to scarcity, occasionally a title would be designated a rental exclusive, meaning that the only way to play the game was to go to Blockbuster and rent a copy of it, because it wasn't available to purchase via normal channels. This means that certain games like this are extremely rare these days, especially in complete condition, due to the fact that the only way that someone got a hold of them was because Blockbuster eventually sold off the unneeded stock. Good examples of that are Clay Fighter Sculptor's Cut for the Nintendo 64 and Final Fight Guy for the Super Nintendo. However, with all the searching that I did, I could only find one clear rental exclusive from the Genesis, and that was John Madden Champion Edition. So, what gives here? I'll be honest, I don't have an answer, and to make things more confusing, in searching on eBay, I found copies that either didn't have a sticker at all, or copies that had another larger sticker on top that said also available on Sega CD, and that was on the outer cover covering up that rental special sticker. My best guess is that this was a timed exclusive, with the initial copies being dedicated to Blockbuster and Hollywood Video when the movie was in the theaters, and then later shipments going to Electronics Boutique, Babbage's, etc., and those copies are the ones without stickers or with the cover-up stickers. If anyone knows what the true story is here, please comment down below, but it's possible that there was a special release here, and that may have contributed to the value of the game on the resale market these days. Moving on, all versions of the game, Genesis, Sega CD, and Super Nintendo, were exclusive to the United States, so there's no alternate covers to compare this to, and the art used is what appears to be a still from the film that looks similar to the original movie poster, but slightly different. Why didn't they just use the original poster art? No idea, but I'm guessing that maybe there was some sort of rights issue with the artist. It's fine, although the logo probably needs to stand out a bit more at the top. Flipping over the back, and there's 4 somewhat blurry and incomplete screenshots. I get trying to be artistic with the presentation, but shouldn't you have made sure the screenshots were decent quality before ripping off a quarter of them? As far as the text goes, I like the bullet points used, but then the flavor text ends up basically restating the bullet points, so not sure what the point was there unless they just thought that being redundant was a good thing. Opening up the package, and we've got the manual, which looks barely used, and the warranty reply card as a nice bonus. You can tell this is a later release because the manual has some nice graphic design to it and features not just screenshots from the game, but also pictures from the movie, which is cool, but with all of them being in black and white, a lot of them are difficult to make out. For instance, this shot of the crypt level, which is essentially all black. Unfortunately, this is a Sega-specific issue because the Super Nintendo version at least stands out a bit due to being in color, and clearly Sony couldn't be bothered to make 2 different versions of the manual. The manual itself is decent, with descriptions of the basic controls, enemies, and each of the levels. However, it leaves a bit to be desired by not discussing a certain element of the game that I'll talk more about in a bit. Okay, that's the package. Let's get into the game and see how Sony attempted to make a game out of the movie, and if they were successful or not. Briefly, before we get into the game, it probably makes sense to discuss the movie a bit, just as a point of reference for what the game does or doesn't do. Now, as mentioned in the intro, I'm not going to attempt to review the movie itself. There's lots of people out there that are much better equipped and trained to do film reviews besides me. But just so that everyone that maybe hasn't seen the movie knows what's going on, like me before this last week, the movie stars Kenneth Branagh, who also directed, as Victor Frankenstein. As indicated by the title, the movie attempts to retell the story of Frankenstein and his monster directly from the original Gothic tale, as opposed to newer revisions of the story that feature a large green or gray-skinned creature with metal bolts in his neck and a humpbacked assistant named Eeyore. As the movie goes, it does its job and stays more or less faithful to the original work, with a few changes here and there, but that's pretty normal for trying to fit a novel into a 2-hour time slot.
I will say though that the movie seems like it has trouble deciding what kind of movie it wants to be, with certain scenes early on seemingly not being out of place in some other period piece like Pride and Prejudice, and then about an hour into the movie, things finally start to ratchet up into more of an action thriller after the creation of the monster. This is where the game comes in, because let's face it, there's really not much that goes on in that first hour that you could really make a video game out of. It's also important for the game to start at that point because in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you don't play as Victor trying to stop his malformed creation. Oh no, you play as the creature itself, which I was pretty shocked to find out was played by Robert DeNiro, as I had no idea he had any involvement in the film, which just goes back to what I stated earlier about wanting to review this game over Bram Stoker's Dracula due to going into it knowing nothing about it. The game loosely follows the second half of the movie, with things starting via an animated cutscene showing Victor working away in his lab in Ingolstadt and bringing the creature to life. I actually like the detail that was used here, with the art showing clear inspiration from the film, down to the point of drawing the creature in the birthing tank, complete with stitches around his left eye. However, the game quickly shifts into the first level, and you're out in the streets of Ingolstadt running amok. As mentioned, you play as the creature, not as Victor Frankenstein. Now, there's plenty of literary arguments out there about who the actual villain is in the book, whether the monster is the creature or the man who created life out of, quote, materials, not once but twice, with seemingly no regard for what would happen afterwards. I'll leave you to your own conclusions there. Having said that, there's going to be people out there that are going to be a bit surprised to play as the creature. I mean, in Castlevania, which this game is desperately trying to emulate, you don't play as Dracula, you play as a Belmont. But I've got to be honest, I think it fits and was the right decision. When it comes down to it, Victor is just a doctor/scientist, driven bad by the death of his mother. He is not a soldier or a fighter and doesn't have any special abilities. Whereas the creature, well, the creature can't seem to go 5 minutes without getting into some sort of altercation, and due to whatever process Victor used, he's been blessed/cursed with superhuman strength, which is shown many times during the movie. Along with the decision to make the creature the focus of the game, I've got to give credit to the developers for following the plot of the film with the levels. With any type of movie adaptation into a video game, there's going to be some artistic license taken. A movie is simply not a game, and some movies require more adaptation than others. But in the case of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I think they did a solid job of reflecting what goes on in the second half of the movie, minus one glaring issue: the second level. In the movie, the creature is created, discarded by Frankenstein, and then makes his way into Ingolstadt, where he is attacked by crowds, and honestly, you probably shouldn't feel bad about that. I mean, those same crowds flat out murdered Frankenstein's servant Justine without any kind of trial later on. Anyway, to escape, he pretends to be dead and is taken out of town on a cart of corpses. However, in the game, the second level has the creature escaping the city via a crypt before making it to the countryside. I'm not sure where they got this from, unless maybe it's from the book and not the movie. From a content perspective, I don't mind the diversion as it does fit in with the rest of the game, but if we're talking about how closely the game matches the movie, this does have to get called out. Once you get outside the base structure of the game, things start to fall apart. I mentioned that the game is clearly trying to be a Castlevania clone, and honestly, I suppose if you're going to try to copy something to make your game, you might as well copy something good. Unfortunately, the developers at Bit Studio, who apparently specialized in film adaptations based on the resume, are not Konami. The first problem that you'll notice immediately is that the controls feel sluggish. I'm not sure if that's the right description, but it definitely doesn't feel crisp and precise, which is a problem for an action platformer. The jumping you'll get used to, and thankfully for the most part, you're not having to deal with pits or other hazards if you miss a jump. But the combat simply never feels right, and your best option is always to either try to avoid fights, if possible, or sneak up on enemies and take advantage of the creature's range, hitting them before they can hit you. Because otherwise, you will be taking hits, and the creature is not exactly Jackie Chan out there when it comes to attack speed. With limited and usually hidden health power-ups, you're going to want to conserve all of the energy you can, and that means not trying to go toe-to-toe with people and animals. The next issue is one that I made reference back to in the manual section. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein tries to mix things up a bit and not only be a hack-and-slash platformer. It does this with the introduction of an inventory system that contains various items and notes that you pick up as you explore the levels. Now, I'm all for a game trying to add a bit of depth, and the goal here was to give players the options of using their heads rather than just their brawn. So, what's the problem? Well, the main issue is that the manual doesn't exactly explain how to use the inventory system. And don't get me wrong, I think the goal here was to have an almost point-and-click styled inventory where there's definitely going to be some trial and error before you figure out what things need to be combined, assuming you even found them as you explored the level to begin with. The problem is, nowhere is there indication of how the items should be combined, and when they are, how to use them. This all could have been solved either via a very quick tutorial or even just mentioning which buttons do what in the control section, but apparently they felt like that would have made things too easy or something. They might as well have pretended the feature didn't exist, which would be somewhat excusable if the game controlled better and could be played as a straight platformer, but it doesn't. Frankly, I don't get it. This was a major selling point of the game advertised on the back of the box, and as far as I can tell, making fire in the last mission via the item system is absolutely required to get to the second half of that level. So leaving this cryptic is a pretty big miss. Beyond the inventory system apparently being a bit of an afterthought, the level designs tend to be a bit confusing as well. I don't mind all of it necessarily, and actually I like the whole concept of having to figure out which switches do what, as it keeps things from being just walking from left to right without really having to explore. The problem is that in other games, usually when you get the right combination, the switches will lock into place, so you don't have to second guess yourself if you did the right thing or not. And if it's a switch that you can hit multiple times, usually it's pretty obvious. But here, there's plenty of times where what you're triggering is occurring off screen, so it's hard to form direct A to B correlations of events, especially when there's plenty of switches that appear to be red herrings and that don't actually do anything at all. The graphics in-game are a bit of a mixed bag. As mentioned, I like the cutscenes that tell the story between the levels, but as far as the levels themselves, I expected more from a 16 megabit cartridge. I mean, there are only 6 levels, 7 if you count the boss fight at the Frankenstein mansion as a separate level, and the levels themselves don't have a ton of variation to them, aside from the final level on the Alexander Nevsky, which has 2 distinct areas. I suppose that there is decent animation to the characters. The game boasts using rotoscoping from real motion capture actors, and the character movement is very fluid as a result. However, it seems like that they forgot to actually color the sprites after capturing the frames, with some enemies looking almost black and white. I know the Genesis has issues with color depth, but this is ridiculous. And for the icing on the half-ass cake, the levels employ some nice parallax scrolling in the background, but you won't see it 95% of the time because normally you can't see any of those layers. From an audio perspective, the music in-game is actually pretty solid. It's not the best soundtrack that I've ever heard, but it's not bad, and it definitely has its share of gothy synths that fit with the on-screen action. I think the only real issue with the music goes along with the design of the game, in that if you don't know a level well, either it's your first or second time playing it, or you're trying to hunt for some item or secret that you missed, you're going to be in that level for a while, listening to that same level music the entire time. For me, it wasn't really an issue because it was inobtrusive enough so that I could concentrate on what was going on the screen, but I could see some people tiring of it. Thankfully, there is at least a different fanfare for boss fights to mix things up a bit. Unfortunately, the sound effects don't hold up as well, and it's clear that more effort went into the soundtrack. There's just not very many effects, so most of the time the game will be relatively quiet aside from the music, and when they are present, they are very rough, even for FM samples. So it's almost like that they were just an afterthought, and the team was like, Okay, you only have X space left on the ROM for effects, so just throw in a few low quality ones and we'll call it a day. Playing and watching Mary Shelley's Frankenstein this week was an interesting experience, to be sure. I didn't know what to make of Robert DeNiro playing the creature, and the film being an odd mix of period piece versus action movie, complete with writing from Frank Darabont, simply never felt right. Likewise, the game never really feels like it knows what it wants to be. Does it want to be a Castlevania clone, or does it want to be a point-and-click adventure? And like anything that doesn't ever really have a cohesive vision, the game suffers. It's not the worst licensed game from a movie that I've ever played, but Mary Shelley's Frankenstein has some significant issues, and due to that, I'm giving it 2 stars. If you really love platformers or Castlevania-type titles, it might be worth checking out, but I definitely wouldn't spend money on it.
And that's it for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Believe it or not, I think there's a good game here that perhaps some tweaks could improve, and it's much better than something like Shakan, which is just a disaster in comparison. But one thing that I couldn't get past was, who was this game for? How many kids out there saw the movie to begin with, and then were like, wow, I really need more of this in my life? Having said that though, I'm very curious to play the Sega CD version the next time around, due to it being a different game and not just the same thing with some video sequences thrown in. Should be interesting at very least. Next time on the channel, it's back to the 8-bit powerhouse, the Master System. Although, due to its age and format, I've got a feeling that this game might not feel quite so powerful. However, we've seen games before like Hang On and Astro Warrior where it's not necessarily the size of the dog in a fight, but the size of the fight in the dog, as the saying goes. So perhaps Sega will have another heroic effort up their sleeves with this one. Or it could be totally disappointing. I could see it going either way. Regardless, I'll be excited to look at yet another game that I've never played before, this one almost 40 years old now. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 258. If you like what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later!